So, no, yeah. I say that a lot. Yes. Politics like we did. International edition. Yeah. I never knew that. He's been on the radio. Yeah. Hey, that bloke talking on the radio. Gee, I like that bloke on. You know, ABC Late Night Live, the Christian hero. Oh, yeah, Christian hero. Yeah, gee, he's been on a long time now. It's one of the highlights of the he's got such knowledge. And he sees the laughter that comes out. I think that's what he's thinking. Just have us. Well, he's in a variety of places. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome to this study group. So today is really interesting. The topic is very interesting. So, but my name is Sutarsa, so I'm from AU Medical School. So, but also doing a lot of research in Indonesia. So before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. So we are from Nanawal country. And I would like also to pay my respect to elders past and present. So today we have Pak John. So we'll be talking about climate resilience in the community setting. So I think we are quite familiar about the impact of climate. But John in particular will try to explore the intersection between climate, food, agroforestry from the community resilient perspective. So the topic of the talk on the screen, community pathways to food security, agroforestry and climate resilience, so escaping the Moloch trap in Eastern Indonesia. So this particular study funded by DFAT Australia through a Connexi program, and Pak John is one of the grantees for the climate change round. So a little bit about our speakers today. So John, Professor John McAtee is an academic researcher at Crawford School of Public Policy in Rural Development, Agro-Food System, as well as governance in Indonesia. So his work combines field-based inquiry and policy analysis, mainly focusing on institutional change, livelihood, and local government. So just a couple of notes. So this is a hybrid presentation. So we will be taking questions directly from the audience, as well as also from the Zoom, and we will be reading them out during the session. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, John.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to Norina and Chacha for organising and inviting me, chasing me down. So this comes out of a 3 or 4 year process we've engaged with, looking at this set of issues in Eastern Indonesia, particularly in flores. And we have a Cecil B. DeMille kind of cast of characters who have been involved, including Bimo, who's at the back here. But the 4 main people involved, besides myself, Mbak Karina from Akatiga, Pak Prudence, who's Orang Florenese, who's a professor at in Jakarta, and Soraya Afif, who everyone I think he knows from UI. But we also have other people like Rini Astuti, who I should have mentioned up there, who's also played a really important role. And you know, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful support of Connexi and their patience with us as we've gone through this process. And of course, any opinions here don't represent Connexi; they represent myself and our team's perspectives. So Um, Unless you've been living under a rock, you would have seen this notion of a polycrisis. And there's various takes on the polycrisis. One take on the polycrisis is this notion of, or responses to it, is the notion that we need a socio-ecological transformation. And particularly around rural vulnerability, food and nutritional insecurity, amongst other problems. Now, there are various definitions of what a transformation entails and whether it can actually be steered or engineered. But this kind of notion of transition is really embedded in a lot of the donor literature, in notions of climate change adaptation, in agroecology, and in the few plus nexus approach, which the Bapanas has embraced. So this is a really pervasive framing. And of course, some people question whether we can steer or engineer a transformation, whether transformations just emerge through crises. In fact, in many cases, they're considered to be quite rare, but nonetheless, this is kind of the framework that people are thinking with. On the other hand, there's now an emerging, and this is really prevalent in Europe, a group of people called the collapsologists. I don't know whether there's even a podcast, if you look on Spotify, on collapsology. So there's a lot of people studying collapse, and a lot of people now who've got very pessimistic, including a lot of climate activists, around the way everything's heading. And so this is a contrasting perspective to this kind of transformative agenda. But in places like Flores, what you see are these everyday life-making and future-making practices of local people. And this is what we've really been focusing on, because unfortunately, the policy response is not quite there yet, although to give full credit to Bapanas, who have also supported this work. And I should acknowledge also the local government and the provincial governments in Flores and in Kupang, who've really also supported us. They're really interested in this few plus nexus approach, but I'm not going to address that directly. But in Eastern Indonesia, these are some statistics that emerge from provincial government data around some of the problems in Nusa Tenggara and in Flores. And these statistics point to a kind of an emerging crisis. I mean, maybe people who've been working on this long term would say these are embedded problems, but they're really, if you look at them, from my perspective, with what's been going on in the last few years, it feels like part of the polycrisis. And on top of that, of course, this is Gunung Leuser Tobi. When we arrived to do our fieldwork, we chose a number of different sites, and one of them is quite close to Gunung Leuser Tobi, and it looked like a beautiful backdrop for our research. But then the last 2 or 3 years, it's almost continuously erupted, and this is one slide. And then we've had the earthquake, and on top of this, El Nino. So this sense of emerging or deepening climate change related crisis on top of other issues is really becoming much sharper. So one of the questions then is, how do we think about the processes generating vulnerability, and how do we address them? And the Connexi project has really been a great opportunity to think about some of these issues, because we're building on the shoulders of all the people that have come before us. There's an enormous literature, of course, on these problems in Eastern Indonesia. And what we were trying to do is to use this project as an opportunity for rethinking some of these complex linkages and independencies, and to see whether we can see possible transformation pathways in these landscapes. And this is what Bapanas really encouraged us to do. So as we thought about it, the thing that really emerged is that so much of the programmatic material on Eastern Indonesia, naturally, or in development sphere more broadly, has this kind of normative or programmatic approach about what should happen for development to happen. And a lot of the work in agroecology and food systems is also generated in this kind of way. But we wanted to shift more to a diagnostic approach. And one of the ways we wanted to think about it was in terms of these multiple interlinking relational processes. And what by relational, I mean, these are processes where change happens through relationships. They can be relationships between people, institutions, environments, and economic systems. And the idea here is that these different elements shape each other. So although I'm not a system theorist, this kind of idea is pervasive. And this is the idea behind the few plus nexus approach that the Indonesian government has embraced in their strategic planning documents. So what we wanted to do, and now there's a lot of literature showing that these multiple interacting relational processes generate specific distributions of vulnerability. Okay, I mean, it may be getting a little bit theoretical. I hope I'm not losing you all. But basically, to pin it down into more specific research questions, what we wanted to look at how these different processes shape patterns of climate vulnerability or precarity and nutritional insecurity. And then we want to look at how households respond. Because if anything, what you find at the field level is incredible repertoire of responses, which we'll come to later in the paper. And we also wanted to look at what constrains or might enable more transformative changes. And as we developed our analysis, we became really interested in this kind of kue lapis, to use an Indonesian metaphor, this layer cake of processes that go on simultaneously. So we have these ecological processes, which shape the opportunities for agriculture. We have the agrarian change and agroforestry dynamics, and we have these gendered labour, care work and migration dynamics, and we have these territorial governance arrangements. And when we put these different layers together, what we get is the icing on the cake, which is kind of the forms of precarity and insecurity in these landscapes. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these layers one by one, okay? So next time you eat your kue lapis, you can think about flores. So in terms of our methods, we were interested in comparing lowland and upland areas of flores, and this is a list of all the tools. I'm not going to go through them all one by one, but the key thing for me, the key thing that Connexi enabled, which was fantastic, was that we had sufficient funding for all these multi-stakeholder workshops, both at the village level and at the hamlet level, all the way up to the provincial level. So you can see different photos from, this is at one village in eastern Indonesia, in eastern Flores, and at the top we have a workshop we did with provincial government stakeholders. And it was an enormous privilege to have these interactions with people. This is partly through which we tested our ideas and we enriched them, and we actually, the provincial government has taken some of our ideas into their food security planning documents, which I'll come to a little bit later. Okay, so now beginning the first process, the ecological process. Clearly, you know, this is a photo taken from a paper looking at climate change in Nusa Tenggara. Nusa Tenggara clearly is a semi-arid region. It only has a 4-month wet season, and the rainfall is about 36% below the national average. So I've mainly worked in Western Indonesia, and so it was really amazing to go to Flores in the wet season because the rain is squashed into a very short period, and it's really a drastic wet season, but it happens incredibly fast. And on top of this, we have El Nino, the Indian Ocean dipole. So we get this heightened vulnerability and unpredictability to their weather patterns, which has a significant impact on their livelihoods. Yeah.
Can you explain what those pictures are? We can't read the small font.
So I'm not going to go through, this is a picture from, I'm not going to explain the climatology of Nusa Tenggara. Sorry.
I was asking you to tell me what the pictures are showing me.
Well, the pictures are showing you the degrees of temperature variation. And it's part of a narrative in the paper about how climate change is affecting agriculture in Nusa Tenggara. But
temperature variation over what period?
Sorry, I'll just put that up as an illustration. I'm not going to go and explain the paper.
Sorry, Johnny, but mainly red means very high, if my poor eyesight.
Yeah, it's very high. Maximum temperature. So the idea, I think, in the paper is that these places with very extreme temperatures are going to be facing climate shocks and are more exposed to climate variability. I think, and there are, because of the microclimates in Nusa Tenggara are so varied, there are other areas that are less affected. And I'll explain this as we go on. But sorry, I'm not a climatologist, so I can't really explain that paper. So, but, you know, feel welcome to download it. Part of these ecological processes, part of the exposure of local people is the fact that 60% of people in Flores and I think Nusa Tenggara in general are still dependent on rain-fed small-scale farming. And what you'll see on the far left picture is the rice failure. It's still mainly dry land rice in the areas where we are, although there's a little bit of sour. So in one of our focus group discussions, the stakeholders, the local people said that they estimated that rice production had decreased by about 50% over the last 10 or 15 years. But they're still highly dependent on rice. And each year they go out and try and plant dry land rice. And a harvest failure for them is if they only get 40% or 30% of what they expect. But it's still, they have a rice that, depending on the household, extends for several months into the year. And the other point that comes out of this kind of ecological process is really the immense biosecurity problems they have in Nusa Tenggara. They have like swine flu, and they have even an infection that's been affecting all the bananas. They get every year, if you go there at the beginning of the wet season, all their chickens seem to die from bird flu. So that we've got this wide range of biosecurity problems. And the links to climate change are not all that clear. I haven't read papers on this. One of the problems of doing this kind of research is the multidimensional nature of the problem. So we can't be experts on everything. So the next layer in our cake, if you like, is the agrarian change and agroforestry dynamics. Flores and Nusa Tenggara, despite its dryness, still exports considerable quantities of coffee, cacao, cashew, and coconuts. In fact, these tree crops produce about 70% of the exported primary commodities from this part of Indonesia. The problem, of course, is that their forest gardens are half as productive as the forest gardens you find in Western Indonesia. So, and it's partly due to a lot of these factors I've already talked about. For instance, this is a Kemiri or candle nut forest garden, and one of the attributes of candle nut is you can't create a complex agroforestry system like you have in Java, because the Kemiri trees don't allow ecologically all of the kind of multiple cropping systems that you have. And also they're very resistant to dry seasons, but they're like our eucalyptus trees. It's very hard to crop something underneath them. So what we did to try and understand agrarian change in our village sites is we did a kind of poverty ranking exercise using communities' own categories of poverty. And the community actually, and these are the Florinese terms over on the left, they categorize their own communities in terms of these three different levels. And what's interesting is that since they began tree cropping, the tree cropping only really took off in the Suharto period. In the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of conflict over forest in Flores, and because of the deforestation related to Sweden agriculture in the uplands, the government introduced cashews and Kemiri, candle nut, and these took off. And as the community embraced these cash crops, you hardly find anybody any longer in this category. So everybody's moved up into the top two categories, which is quite a significant achievement through their embracing cash cropping. But the problem is that by and large, they embraced these cash crops 20 or 30 years ago, and the trees need replanting because they're past their productive age. we'll come back to some of these issues as we go forward. So part of the intensification process which has gone on is that they've abandoned swing agriculture to some extent, and that some groups have done really well out of this process, and some people are remaining, a large percentage of the people are remaining in the second group, which is still unstable and transiently insecure. To make issues more challenging, they face, like many rural people in Indonesia, a financial squeeze due to rising expenditure, because people can no longer exist in the subsistence economy, but at the same time, they're integrated into the cash economy on pretty adverse terms. So although they have these, they often might have 2 or 3 different crop systems, there's still periods in the year where they don't have any cash income, so they resort to debt. So there's been a whole wave of microcredit systems that have emerged in Eastern Indonesia. And what we found in our survey is that 63% of households have debt, and some of them are paying up to 45% interest. Although I understand that just recently the president has changed the regulations around microcredit, and the MECA system, he's put the debt, I think, down to about 8 or 10%. So the government's trying to address this issue. But one of the responses of people of being stuck between this financial pressure and their less productive food crops and cash crops is to migrate. So in our surveys, we found that 56% of households had a member who had migrated, and 42% of households had a member who was currently migrating. And this has got worse since the mountain Gunung Lewatobi erupted. I talked to a school teacher and he said half the children in his class, the fathers were absent. And they're by and large going off to find precarious work in the oil palm sector in Kalimantan. So there are a set of structural factors which I think we really need to take into account when we look at the vulnerability. And I haven't got time to go through all these one by one because there are so many of them. But one of the problems is monopoly market structures where people sell their kemiri, their cattle nut and their cashew and their other products into these commodity value chains, and they get very low prices, and they're really not processed in any way, even though technologies exist. Then we get this patron-client financial structure where people sell their crop to the middleman, and it's usually a man, in advance of the harvest. And then they which means that they get less price for their crop. They sell it unprocessed, and sometimes their crop doesn't fail, so they kind of become more deeply indebted. And then we get this pattern of precarious work in the oil palm sector, where I don't need to talk to you about this. I think you all know the oil palm sector. The contract and recruitment systems, as they work for the Florinese, mean that most people end up very precarious. And this is made worse by the fact that people don't realize this about oil palm, but oil palm has what's called a musim trek. So it's a period in the year where production falls. And during this low yield season, for precarious workers, piece workers, buruh harian lepas not on proper contracts, they have no income and no safety nets. So they might save a lot of money during the harvest period, and then during the musim trek, they go into debt. So they end up not sending many remittances back to their families. And so we get this point that comes out in a lot of the climate change literature, that vulnerability is fundamentally a relational state. By this, I mean we need to look at the way that people are inserted in all these sorts of relationships, whether they're market relationships or their oil palm contracting systems, and that this is one of the factors that shapes climate change vulnerability, because climate change intensifies these existing socio and economic vulnerabilities, and that's widely found in the literature. Okay, so let's keep going to our next layer in the kue lapis, the layer cake. Conexi was really very encouraging for us to incorporate this gendered labour, care work and migration aspect into the work. And it ended up, I think, becoming one of the more interesting parts of it. So social reproduction, which is a jargon piece of term that many of you mightn't have heard of, it's really quite simply the processes through which people sustain life. They care for others and how they reproduce the family, how they reproduce their social relations across generations. And I'll explain this in a minute in the next slide. So here is a diagram which I made for another paper, but I've adopted for this. So these, if you look at up the top, oops, what happened then? Ooh, I won't do that again. The socially necessary consumption, the food and nutrition, you have to think about, there's a smallholder production from their subsistence gardens. There's their commodity production from their tree gardens. And then there's labour migration, where a lot of them leave. And then there's all these unpaid non-market relations and activities. And if you put all these different circuits together, all these different elements together, that's where we get how they meet their consumption needs. The problem, as I explained, is that it's very difficult for a household to cover all these bases at once. We'll explain this as we go forward. Now here, oops, I think I missed a slide, did I? There's one missing. But Mbak Karina had a quote, which she got from Fieldwork, where she quoted a neo-landless labourer, who's neo-labourist female who lives with 2 children and a grandmother, with a husband who's migrated to Kalimantan. And this is what she said: "I can't do it alone. I'm too busy. It's exhausting looking after the children and grandmother and also managing the water. When the water is released, we're at the end of the line because the landowners take the water first. If I want to get the water, I have to go at night. It's not possible." So this is one example of the multiple strains on women who partners have migrated off to Kalimantan, and they have to hold together all these different elements. And this picture illustrates all the different pressures on women. So we get all these different aspects, to some degree driven by the feminisation of agriculture as the males depart for Kalimantan, which has an effect on how they look after the children. Like in one case, I went to interview a woman for a food security survey. And what I came across at 5 PM was her 2 children under 7 wandering around in front of the house, really quite dirty. The house was in very terrible condition, and she was still off an hour and a half away back up in her forest garden, because she was trying to make enough income from that to look after the children. But meanwhile, here were these 2 children who looked so sad. I actually withdrew and didn't pursue interviewing her, because it was so sad to watch those 2 children really not being cared for. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I'm just pointing to the fact that women left with these really high burdens, it leads to what the literature calls depletion of social reproduction, that they're not able to put the energy into reproducing the family. And this has a very large impact on nutrition. Often they come home so exhausted, they resort to fast foods, they aren't able to cook properly, all these sorts of things, which are often neglected in a lot of the food security literature, which tends to treat food security as a medical condition. And if we can just give them the right vitamins in a supplement, I mean, that's good. I'm not disparaging that approach. I think it's important, but this aspect also needs to be looked at. So to sum up how we think about the community strategies, we can see 4 main community strategies for dealing with the situation they find themselves in. They shift to perennial crops for cash income. They engage in social reproduction through mixed gardens, livestock, barter, debt, and unpaid care work. They diversify their livelihoods largely through migration. And then we find, which we haven't had time to talk about in this paper, all these micro adaptation strategies that farmers engage in to try and keep their production going. I'm just aware I'm using up a lot of time. I might have to go a bit faster. So just to deepen this a little bit and to show you some of the food security questions that this brings out, we use this methodology that the FAO has called HDDS. I had it down there. I don't know where the methodology part of this slide's gone. But anyway, this methodology groups people into 3 different groups depending on the diversity of their diets and the number of food groups that they eat. Now, it's very technical. I don't have time to go into this. I know many of you will be interested in it. But the things that we came out of this in the 3 hamlets in one of the villages, you could see this incredible variation in terms of who is vulnerable and who's not. So the yellow, this group are the low diversity households, whereas the blue are the medium density households. And now this is in the scarcity season. So you can see some hamlets, people are doing really well. In other hamlets, people are really struggling. So we need to understand a little bit about the food system. We found it quite amazingly, people collect up to 78 different sorts of food from the forests and from their gardens. But the problem is that about 60% of households only collect a very limited number of the food types. And there's a core basket that they focus on, and this basket shrinks in the scarcity season, which in Flores is the wet season. And we get this incredible variation even at the hamlet level, depending on the availability of land, access to the landscapes, the microclimate, the social networks, and the social assistance and the care capacities of the community. And we also get socioeconomic differences affecting diet quality. So this is not just everyone has access to rice broadly, but inequality widens during the scarcity season, and this comes out clearly in this slide. So some hamlets we found up to 50% of people were in the low food diversity category. You can see this hamlet, 75% are in the low food diversity category in the wet season. Now, the other aspect of it is clearly seasonality really drives food insecurity. So, and forest gardens are the fallback landscape where during the scarcity season, people turn to pursuing these other crops. I think the key point here, though, is that we also did a household food security access scale, different methodology, and you can see with the severity of the situation facing the people of Flores with the eruption of the volcano, things have got really quite difficult. So if you look in this slide, you can see the differences in food diversity between the wet season and the dry season. That's in one of the better villages, but this one shows you these are 2 different villages. The amount of people that are food secure compared to various degrees of food insecurity. Okay, so what you can see in this is that most of the population in many of these hamlets are facing various degrees of deep food insecurity in the scarcity season. So this is the reason why so many people want to migrate out, particularly given the severity of the situation now with eruptions, volcanoes, and now El Nino coming. To take this further, we did an analysis in one of the villages to look at the different sorts of outcomes around the 2 different classes of people. And what we found is that the more capable households, we even found quite considerable food insecurity amongst capable households. They need strategies, what we call in the literature, stepping up or stepping out. They need to be able to step beyond their production systems in order to intensify their production systems in order to avoid this food insecurity. But for the vulnerable households, the people with less than 3 hectares of commodity gardens, what we find is that the most vulnerable are the female and elder households. But what we found was so surprising is this group of people in the vulnerable households who are pursuing migration successfully, and although the households in the village is still a female-headed household, the women are able to withstand this triple burden. Okay, so we see this diversity in different outcomes. So, this comes to another point. Now, this is maybe, there's a lot of literature now that uses the term Moloch. Is people familiar with this term? Moloch was a biblical god, and this Moloch has become a metaphor for a system that demands terrible sacrifices. And Moloch was a god in the Old Testament, which to whom people would sacrifice their children. So the idea of a Moloch is of a system that requires sacrifice, terrible sacrifices. So what we find here in Flores is this trade-off that households have to make between pursuing subsistence crops, intensifying their forest gardens, pursuing cash income, for instance, by migration, or supporting their social reproduction. So they're meant to do all these things at once, but this is kind of a trap for many of them because it forces them to focus on their short-term and immediate requirements. But as they do so, they sacrifice their long-term futures. So you can see over here, I've got AI to give you a picture of Moloch, this god, and these are the things that people have to sacrifice. We get undermining of the sustainability of agroforests, we get depleted social reproduction, we get the issues of family cohesion because the male is often Kalimantan for so long, we get divorce, all these sorts of problems, people over in Kalimantan remarrying, labour, precarity and poor nutrition. So the question really is, how do we get, in this diagram we estimate, going back, around 50% of households in this particular village, which is one of the better villages, were stuck in this Moloch trap. So how do we get them out of that? Now, if you look at the literature, there's this notion of territorial approaches to food security and nutrition policy. And so what do they mean by territorial approaches? So this is really suggesting that food system problems are also governance problems. So this problem is not just a technical problem of giving people the right crop or giving them the right machine to process their kemiri, the canola nut, which has all been tried. It's also connected to the way territorial governance works. So what is territorial governance? This is a definition, the system of ideas, the processes and practices that shape the way the territory operates. So you might say, look at the way districts in Nusa Tenggara operate and look at the way these territories are kind of governed. And so the idea of the territorial governance approach is that we should develop participatory and inclusive territorial management and transform the food systems and forms of vulnerability we find there. Okay, so this is, again, another form of this transformation narrative. The other thing that's going on in our landscapes is this emergence of social forestry. And social forestry really represents an opportunity for regenerating the agroforest system. The problem is that many of these territorial governance problems come out in agroforestry, which is overall a very legalistic process. It's focused on, it doesn't really deal with the fact that farmer producer groups are not yet effective. It doesn't deal with the market problem and hasn't really been up to institute peer-to-peer learning processes to sustain community resilience. And women tend to be excluded. And so what we find is social forestry programs can work in particular project enclaves, but beyond these little enclaves where there's a project, they tend to not be very effective. Okay, so I'm not throwing aspersions on people. I think there's a lot of people trying to get these systems to work, and it's very challenging. So the other thing too about coming from Western Indonesia to Eastern Indonesia to do some research is all the reports left behind by all the people who's come before us. And there was a lot of interesting and really well-developed, fascinating material to read. And I haven't read through all of them. And I'm sure Jim Fox can probably put me on to updating other theses and other material that I haven't really been up to read. But these are just some that I've had a look at. And what we find is a lot of insights from these reports. And they show that what they tend to point to as a solution is developing cashew or candle nut systems that can, in ways that address these problems of pests, poor genetics, climate risks, and the driving extremely low yields, and addressing the low return livelihoods. And there's a number of different other sorts of recipes they have for addressing these problems. The problem from many of these projects or processes is that they tend to have a project orientation, which is time bound with fixed goals and budgets and a technical framing. Okay, which is fine. I'm not down on that. The problem is though that they don't deal with the underlying structural constraints that are creating these forms of vulnerability. They don't address the four underlying processes we're talking about. Now, this is not easy. I talked to someone once at the World Bank about this sort of issue, and he said, "What are you expecting, the Russian Revolution?" So I'm not down on projects because I know how difficult it is, but they focus on technical upgrading and innovation, but these sorts of innovations tend not to stick, because what you see after reading all these reports, and many of them going back many years, is the system is still the same. And one of the points, if you read systems theory on transformation, they talk about deep and shallow leverage points, and that to really change a system, they argue, we need to focus on the deep leverage points. And these projects are unable to do that. And that's not their fault necessarily, because how can a project bring about the Russian Revolution, to use a bad metaphor? You get what I mean, though. It's very difficult to shift these systems. And then we get this list of territorial governance challenges, which I'm not going to go into in any depth, but these emerge through discussions with various stakeholders. Them all, there's a lot of different issues, some of which I've already talked about before, but due to lack of time, I'm not going to go into these in any depth. And I'm sure there's lots of PhD theses already written about all this, and I see Hal nodding his head. So in conclusion, what we argue in the paper, I guess, is that these four different elements of our Kue Lapis, or here it's lingkaran setan, choose your metaphor. Lingkaran setan for non-Indonesian speakers is a vicious circle. The climate precarity and nutritional insecurity sits in the middle of these four processes. So we see a particular alignment of these processes and the relationships they shape, which leads to climate precarity and the possibility of addressing it. So the question, in a way, what we see is a household territory nexus, if you like, around these four different processes. They're coming together in a particular way that creates this nexus, or spaghetti, if you like, of problems that's very difficult to resolve. And that these create the patterns that we see. And now the question is, can we reconfigure them? And this is not an easy question. And I'm not sure that we can address it in our Connexi project, but we're trying to think through some of these problems. Now, one of the key problems, of course, is this Moloch trap. So we get these ecological agrarian change, social reproduction processes and governance challenges leading to the Moloch trap. So how can we think about policy that supports exits from climate precarity and nutritional insecurity? So one of the ways of thinking about this problem is what would be the conditions of possibility for a different sort of territorial governance? What is required to address the structural inequalities and territorial governance issues? Now, in the transformation literature, there's this argument that crisis is also an opportunity, that it's through crises that socio-technical systems tend to change. And you can see this in many cases. And one of the ways that a lot of literature is talking about are developing these participatory learning ecosystems where in particular niches, people can develop different approaches, and that when the crises take hold, this niche example becomes a lesson for broader transformation. But what we need is cross-scale coalitions to get these sort of innovations to take hold. Or this is one of the sets of arguments in the transformation literature. But the problem is this kind of alignment of these different coalitions that already shape what's going on in places like Nusa Tenggara, and how could we enable, or what would make it possible for this coalition of actors to behave differently? It's perhaps beyond the remit of our program, but nonetheless something you can't help thinking about. So we produced a policy paper, which if anyone wants to take us a photo here, you can download our policy paper to suggest particular approaches that the government. There's an Indonesian version too. This is the English version. And we provided this to the provincial and local governments because it emerged largely through our workshops with them. We presented our material and our emerging results, and we shared them with them. And then we developed this policy paper. And the provincial government has been integrating many of our recommendations into this Rencana Aksi Daerah Pangan dan Gizi Berbasis Potensi Sumber Daya Lokal. I forget the acronym. It's got a much more snazzy acronym. So we did two or three workshops with the provincial government about how they could do this. But I'm still waiting to see how it actually ends up in the policy, keeping my fingers crossed that it's still there. But they were really interested in this because they could see these connections that we made right from the village level into their policy processes. So the main thing that we do is in the report, just to summarize, what we found at the village level are all these forms of collective action at the village level, all these strategies that communities are doing. But the government, and this is what Bapanas were interested in us researching, how could policy support the strategies of villages? Because villages have these strategies, but the government doesn't really know all that much about them. But how can we actually support what the communities are doing? Because the communities are the ones that are understanding the main constraints and making these choices. And what we find in Flores Timor, these Comunitas Basis Gereja, which are incredibly vibrant, where we get labour sharing, we get arisan, we get prayer groups, we get mutual assistant groups, a bit like gotong royong, perhaps as it used to be in Java. These kind of ideas or these kind of community-based collective action mechanisms aren't made use of in policy making. What you tend to get is kelompok tani, which come together when there's assistance, but don't persist after the assistance is gone. So the question is whether policy learning could bring in some of these, learn from what village level processes are going on and find space for supporting these grounded life-making and future-making processes. And the provincial government is interested in these ideas, but I'm not sure where it's going to head at this point. So just to sum up our report, these are some of the things we're recommending, that these niche experiments with novel ideas and new governance configurations could be a critical point for experimenting for transformation. And this involves technical, economic, regulatory, social learning, and collective organisation with all these different elements. Working with existing household strategies, moving towards community-centred nexus approach that Bapanas likes, that treats villages as the central primary agents of change. Now, that second point is actually in the Bapanas planning document. So Bapanas was already thinking along these lines to some degree. But we need to integrate agroforestry revitalisation, maintain care work. Care work is largely not focused on in government planning and policy processes. The dynamics of village, I talked about around the depletion of social reproduction, this issue needs to be taken really seriously. And finally, the recognition as migration as a legitimate development strategy. The migrants all go off, but there are no development strategies to help migrants have successful migration pathways, and also to help them ensure that remittances are used productively. There's a whole literature on how you can make use of these migration pathways in development planning, but it's not yet integrated into regional government planning. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about today. I thought Heath is here, and I know Jim Fox is somewhere online, and I know that this appeal is really important, and I'd like to kind of acknowledge the enormous strain that the people of Flores are under. So, you know, look online, you can make a donation. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. So I think there's a lot of issue to back there. So got a few of time, maybe around 40 minutes or 30 minutes.
45 minutes. We have 3 questions online.
Yeah, so we've got 3 already online. So in case anyone have questions in the room, so we start with 1, 2, and then we go to for the online. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John, for the interesting presentation. I'm interested that you say that crisis is important, can open opportunity, but we also understand that that can be realized, the opportunity can be realized when the agency exists. But what do you think the agency, the existing agency of the local community, particularly people that live in rural frontiers like site that not yet studied, is it something that should be concerned? And second one, I also see that because this is the research on the small scale farmers community, actually the finding is quite similar with what literature has said, that in terms of
Sorry, what? Who says?
literatures
Right.
have said, in terms of they trap in the debt, they migrate, the burden to the woman. So what do you think this finding can be generalizable to other sites in Indonesia, or is it specific to Flores because it's very vulnerable to climate because it's small island with a very hot climate? Thank you.
So on the second point around generalizability, I mean, this is a big theme in a lot of methodology textbooks. I guess, I mean, that's a question to be tried out. I mean, in my own research, you find variation on these different forms of vulnerability. You find variations in different places. So different places will have different, a different contextual framing, a different context, and there'll be different elements playing out. So it won't be the same in other places. But I think there are lessons that these kind of processes that I've talked about, I think there'll be similarities with other places, but I mean, that would need to be thought through. So your first question was around agency. I guess this is a little bit challenging in that on the one side, there's a lot of climate change adaptation literature that says it's really unfair and unrealistic on our part to think that poor, disenfranchised, or very weak communities should take on the burden of climate adaptation on their own. You know, given that they didn't cause it, they've become the victims of it. So there's all these kind of policy processes and financial arrangements to try and help communities deal with this. So that's the first point. The second point, I guess, is that there is enormous agency in the communities. There's a lot of, I showed you the different strategies. They're thinking through their strategies all the time. The problem is that there's kind of a disconnect between what communities are thinking and doing and where the policy processes are. They don't seem to in any way meet. And I think this is what Bapanas is hoping to address, is to find ways to do this. And also the literature on transformation talks about, for transformations to happen, you can't just think about these niche local levels. You need to think about the intermediate and the kind of national level. So that is all. Is there an enabling environment at the national and at the provincial level to address these sorts of issues? That's also an agency problem. So we shouldn't just focus on what the local people are doing.
John, thanks very much. This is really, really interesting and important. Thank you. So, sort of broad question, if you don't mind me asking a broad question. Can you marry the big picture development story with your very rich micro level insights? The reason why I ask that is that in an earlier life, I used to look quite closely at the regional accounts, you know, by propensity and also by Kabupaten. So Yogi is not here. Yogi does it still at Canberra Uni.
Right.
So one of the lessons from that was, although you've got to be careful with the stats, NTT, always very poor, as you said, but it was sort of the economy was growing at about the same rate as the national average. That is, the relativities were sort of the same, they're all going up. And so there's something going on, and I appreciate you're more florists, and this is NTT, so you need to disaggregate, but can we marry the two stories that the big picture does suggest there's quite a bit of socioeconomic dynamism, albeit from a very low base, with your story, which is got some positive elements, but it's also quite worrying, sort of trapped in a low-level income almost. So just wondering whether maybe it's a silly question because it's too big a question in a way, but sorry, just to add a little thing, if I may, I would have thought you'd have more on remittances in your story. You mentioned migration quite a lot. There must be a lot of remittances, mustn't there? This guy worked on a lot. So don't they feature quite prominently in the households? And if you think of policy also, wouldn't education be an absolute crucial factor? It's a ladder for economic opportunity and, as you say, migrating out. And often it's permanent migration, isn't it? Not temporary. So just a few questions. And by the way, tourism you don't mention. Tourism now is quite important in Flores, isn't it? Sorry to jumble up a whole lot of things.
Well, they're all interesting points. Which one will I start with? I think the macro micro question is a really interesting one. And I think what you're saying is true because they started from such a low base. And I did show those different poverty strategy strata. So, you know, the first strata has kind of disappeared, which is just amazing.
Yep.
You know, that's an amazing achievement over 20 or 30 years. So that's the first thing to point to. And the fact that a lot of people are going off to migrate and sending back remittances would suggest that measurable economic growth is better. But what we see though is if you go into the food security, in the scarcity season and do food security surveys, is that, you know, like the people with low food diversity are actually just eating rice and vegetables every day, often for weeks on end, no protein. And this is to do with the stunting problem, as well as the squeeze on social reproduction. So that is still part of the story, unfortunately. It's not to say that that upper level, that in the three tiers, have really moved up.
Yep.
And most of them are educating all their children have moved off somewhere else. We did ask a lot of migrant labourers about what happened with migrant labour. And a number of them said, some said, oh, who comes back with a lot of money is able to renovate their house and able to start a new business. One of them said 1 in 100, some of them said 2 in 10. So we didn't have a statistical analysis of that, but it's a small proportion who are able to do that. For most of them, and there was a paper we found from East Kalimantan written by a group of Indonesian researchers from one of the universities of East Kalimantan, which showed that around 60% of the labourers coming from Flores and other places into the oil palm plantations are working in this really very, very precarious way that means so often they don't send any remittances back for long periods of time, unfortunately. And it sounds like, talking to a lot of informants, that it might be 7 to 8 out of 10 are in that situation. There's always the smart ones and the ones who are very strategic who find permanent jobs in those oil palm companies, but they're more or less the minority. So I don't know whether that's answered all, but all those dynamics are there. But I mean, we're going in a particularly bad time with this eruption in the places we've been, an earthquake, and also El Nino. So you could give a positive spin to it, but there's also this other side to it. So which way do you want to go? I mean, the stunting and food security questions are still very, very profound ones.
Thanks.
Maybe we go to online and then back to the.
Do you want to show them here or? No.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I'm just going to read it for you. So the first question is from Nurfianto Giarpanidu. Is the agroforestry that you mentioned earlier a Mamar agroforestry? And what is the potential of cashew agroforestry and its management so that men do not migrate to have a job anymore?
Right, okay. So right on the coast, the cashew only grow well in this part of Flores in a particular niche, particular area right close to the coast. And there is significant cashew gardens there, but some of the reports that I cited up there talks to the fact that you should replant them after a period of time, that they need quite intense management, that they're very susceptible if the rain falls in the flowering season, these sorts of things. And in the period where we've been, the last 3 years where we were doing the field research, the cashew nut harvest, unfortunately, were failing every year. So this was a significant downside. And in the cashew growing hamlets, because one village could have 7 hamlets up a slope, and the cashew growing hamlets are right down towards the coast. And that's where we tend to get the most migration out to Kalimantan because of the failure of the cashew crops. And it's partly related to the variability in the climate.
Yeah, the second question.
Second question is coming from Bu Mei Oi. Based on earlier studies and since your research, do you see any opportunity for potential development, improvements in life toward modernity when you did not mention the availability of formal sector employment and life?
So, of course, I did mention just now in responding to Hal's question that, there are a proportion of people that find employment in the formal sector, but they tend to be from that upper echelon. But one of the criteria of being in the upper echelon is that you send your children complete SMR and university. So people in that group often tend to figure in those kind of pathways, whereas the people in the 2 lower echelons tend not to finish SMR. In fact, there's a lot of problems that they face, and those are the people who end up migrating to. You could stand outside at the end when they graduate high school, and you can meet a group of 5 or 6 men, young guys, all about to migrate off to Kalimantan. You come back a week later, they're all gone, and this is what's going on every graduation season. So it's those people who tend to migrate out. So although these stories are right, we've got these different layers. We've got to think in a differentiated way about who is following those different patterns. Yeah, sorry, Hal.
Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say, is it one way or return migration? That's the key in a way, isn't it?
Well, into the oil palm plantations where most of them go, about 8 out of 10 don't do really well. I mean, if you take one of my informants, we need more statistics on that, and they tend to come back within a year. Maybe they last 3 years. An element of shame about coming back. Some of them stay for 10, 15 years. So there's enormous variation, but maybe someone else has done research on that. That wasn't the object of our research.
Yeah, let's go back to Deborah. Any question? Got 2 again.
Thanks, John. I'm just wondering, your Connexi project that concentrated on Flores, I guess, but it seems that other parts of NTT province are even more precarious, really, in West Timor, where all of those issues that you listed make life much more difficult. The lack of environmental assistance from precipitation and stunting, these sorts of issues are much more. I mean, I think there'd be value in having a look at West Timor versus Flores in many respects. And Sumba is another outlier in that way. They seem to do better in terms of their ecology, their basic environment and entrepreneurship. So I just leave that. But also, you mentioned stunting on a couple of occasions. But you didn't go much further than just mentioned with one mention of anemia. So I'm wondering where that fits into your story. Is it an environmental issue here, or genetic, or what degree?
Well, we didn't really study anemia. This is a problem with sort of research. It's actually everything's connected, and you can't be an expert on everything. But we try to look at the interrelationships between different elements. But I guess anemia, well, probably Pak Nyoman might be better to talk about that as a medical person. But from our perspective, a lot of the food security issues are related, for sure, the lack of income is a big aspect to it, and the insecurity of the male migration route. But the other aspect is the squeezed life-making opportunities for the women that maybe they've got a kebun, a garden that's an hour and a half walk away, but they've got 3 children. So maybe they're breastfeeding one of them and they have to go away, and then they leave their children with one of the neighbours or the grandmother who's unable to really make the child eat nutritious food. Or sometimes they leave food, they cook before they rush off in the morning, and it's cold and not very appetizing, and perhaps it's even poor food. So the children come back from school and they just don't eat the food that's not appealing to them. So you get all these sorts of issues around depletion of social reproduction, and for sure it's affecting the women who are in this kind of precarious position where they've got this triple burden of, looking after their family, looking after their garden. They've still got all these these customary obligations to do with being in the village, etc. Their religious obligations, they have to make contributions in the church. So they're squeezed from multiple fronts, and that for sure there's a medical element of anemia, but there's also this social aspect to it, the socio-economic aspect to it.
I'll just add a point about the tourism talking about a minute ago too. It seems to me that the tourism's pretty narrowly focused on places around Labuan Bajo, so which has got a bit of investment in tourism there. But I just wonder how far it goes beyond that small number of hands around Labuan Bajo, because most of the tourists you find in Flores are backpackers, and I don't know that it's a great solution to Flores.
So the tourism are in enclaves. There's particular tourist enclaves, and most of the people, you can be like in a village 5 kilometers away from where there is a tourist enclave, and nobody's got employment there. That's a classic story of tourism in Eastern Indonesia, I think.
Malika?
Thank you, Pak John. I think one of the key takeaway from your presentation is how to better connect the policy process with what the communities are really thinking about. And depending on your study period, do you see like the differences in terms of the appetite and also capacity of the local governments? Think about it, not only provincial, but also district and also village over the years, knowing that now there are a lot of budget cuts and then a lot of like resources depleted, especially at the village. You're talking about, the village focus kind of solution, but of course there should be resources there. And then how do you see these resources change as the government is changed?
I think you hit the nail on the head. That's really a critical problem, isn't it? And unfortunately, a lot of the money has been pulled out of the Dana Desa, although that I wouldn't say that all the Dana Desa activities have been fantastic, but at least there was an opportunity there for innovation in that space. And the provincial government and the district government now have got the impression I've got is most of their budgets now for routine, for salaries and this sort of thing. So their developmental budgets have largely either dried up or they're tied to particular activities. So yeah, I don't know how to overcome that problem, and clearly it is an issue for some of the things we've been talking about. That there isn't that enabling environment more broadly for addressing some of these issues.
So when was it most of the stakeholder kind of like activities taking place? Was it like in 2024 where you have?
So we've continued to have some. We've had workshops with the provincial government very recently. I mean, there are still opportunities that are opening up for new innovation, particularly around provinces and districts with innovative policy ideas can get special funds from the centre. So there are different channels. So we shouldn't be totally pessimistic. There are opportunities that entrepreneurial policy makers can find for trying to innovate. So it's not completely a sad story.
All right, so we've got 3 online. Maybe we take 2 and then we come back to the room.
Questions from Isnan Fauzi. In Flores, does the historical development intervention since Dutch colonializations interact with the climate variability to create this Moloch trap? In my study in Southwest Timor, we have similar findings. The since post-independence, 1945, central government Jakarta, with their Java-centric plans to force people in Eastern Indonesia to eat rice, which now create kind of dependency to rice. As the young start to forget the indigenous food, they prefer to migrate, and where some of them proud to trafficking.
Yeah, I think there is an element to that. I wouldn't say it was the Dutch necessarily that are responsible for getting everyone hooked on rice. It was also the New Order period. And even up till now, up till recently with things like Ruskin. But the other thing you can see in our research is that local people are still collecting 72, something like 72 varieties of food from the landscape. So the local food systems haven't completely disappeared. It's just that they're not sufficient to meet their requirements, particularly in the scarcity season. And that as the scarcity season takes hold, the number of things that they can gather from the landscape narrows considerably. And I know NTA is experimenting with trying to get people to grow other things, which is a great idea to try and things that are robust and can work across that period. I think it's a really great innovation. I mean, they're already doing that to some degree. But there are all kinds of strategies you can do to try and support local food systems and to, because clearly rice is a highly vulnerable crop. And when you get things like this war in Iran, which affects, the cost of pesticides and the cost of fertilizers, you can see how vulnerable rice systems actually are with, to socio-political shocks. And obviously that's a real worry for Indonesia, isn't it? So the government's trying to develop these diverse food systems, but it's not easy to get people to go back to what they once used to eat.
Second question is coming from James Fox. How is the annual village development funding from the government used in these conditions?
Yeah, so this is a mixed story. I mean, more recently, the development assistance to Dana Desa has shrunk. But what we saw in the villages was that a range of local innovations. For instance, in one of the villages, they bought the small industrial plant to process the candle nut so they could get value added, and they wanted to create a cooperative that could collectively sell the kamiri, the candle nut, off to the producers and overstep the middleman. And unfortunately, though, these kind of innovations are really quite difficult because they need the expertise and they need the support and there's quite a few of those reports that look into the bottlenecks around these sorts of innovations, and it's been very difficult for village governments to get these kind of innovations to work. So it's not. SCR has had a lot of projects of trying to get these things to work, and no doubt NTA has tried as well. There's considerable collective action problems, issues of trust, issues of these captured value chains from the middleman, and the fact that people are in debt, so they'll sell their crops at a low price and unprocessed to the middleman. So it's very hard to come in and bring in a new system that works outside those patronage networks. But they have been trying. And they should keep trying because maybe eventually they can come up with a model that works. But there are real bottlenecks. It's not easy to overcome those collective action problems. I'll be interested to see how NTA's gone at dealing with those issues.
Yeah, this also emerged from the research that I led, very similar in NTT, the use of Dana Desa. The local government actually recognized the issue and the need to use Dana Desa for health adaptation, but there is no guidelines of the new Lebanese have to spend that money. So they decided not to do it to be safe in their reporting. So not for health, in health issue, for example, not that there is no money available. So there is actually some money available from Dana Desa, but how to use it. And that's actually a tension point when we do the research. So they recognize this can be used for adaptation strategy. They don't know how to use it. So because there is no mata anggaran, so in the Dana Desa for health, and potentially that's also for food security. That might be the case as well.
So that's one of the reasons why we're proposing these kind of learning labs. The idea of the learning lab is to get district or perhaps even provincial people, NGOs, church community groups and local village leadership and local community involvement in kind of innovating in that space to try and work out how they can collectively deal with some of these issues. And this is kind of a developmental idea that's kind of floating around. But it hasn't really been tried yet in Nusa Tenggara.
Sarah.
Thank you, John. I just want to ask about your one of the recommendations saying mainstreaming care work. Can you provide some suggestions how we can mainstream care work?
Okay, so unfortunately, Mbak Karin is not here because that's one of the things she's been working on. I think one of the, it's actually in the report. I guess one of the ideas here, it's actually quite difficult to mainstream and it needs a lot of more research on it. But clearly, the dynamics we're talking about around social reproduction are not included in government policy or in developmental interventions. And we need research to try and work out what the implications are of these sorts of findings and how that can be integrated. But we did have some ideas. One of the ideas that Mbak Karin was suggesting was that some kind of, even a collective care work systems for those vulnerable women so that the community could look after their children when they went off to their distant gardens. And maybe some of the dana desa could be used for that. And then we talked to, in a lot of the villages, they had ibu nutrisi, nutrition women, and then you have the Kepala Sekolah, often a woman, and then other leading women. So we had workshops with women's groups around what they thought they could do. And they had a lot of really interesting ideas, which are partly represented in our report. Some of them weren't represented because when we went up to the workshops at the next level, they thought some of them would be too difficult to be implemented. So that's another potential area of follow-up research that would be really good for someone to do, to look at how you can integrate these questions, these social reproduction questions into policy. And that would be a real contribution, I think, to these vulnerable areas of Indonesia, given it's so neglected. I mean, one of the issues too is to fix up the migration pathways. There should be the regulations that Indonesia have around, underpaid labour could be implemented much more comprehensively, so that 60% or whatever of these people that are working precariously in the oil palm sector should all be under contracts and paid much better with proper work safety and social security. What's that? Yeah, we're back to the Russian Revolution again. So the problem is there are so many issues, aren't there? And there's a lot of things to deal with, but not to be depressed about that. There's a lot of opportunities for policy entrepreneurs.
Any more questions in the room? Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much. You used the word security in various ways. And I was just wondering about security in terms of the proportion of the population that is in the army, the police, the government, thinking about their role in these community things. We tend to talk as if farmers were organizing and doing things. But my impression is that often when you walk into a village, you've got the Pamong Praja and you've got all this group of people who have as their assumption that they're controlling things. And have you looked at them specifically? Are they also going out and working small gardens, or and do they get involved, or do they just kind of sit back and tell people what to do?
So in those three tiers in the community, the kind of, if you like, the Florinese class system or whatever you want to call it, the top tier, the people who are secure and tend to have 3 hectares or above, tend to be those people. And they're the ones who got more diverse diets. They're not facing food insecurity. And so they, I think it'd be hard to generalize about those people. There's a wide range of different people, but in places like Flores, I think there's been lots of other research to show the best way to find a secure future is to get a job in the public service in places like Nusa Tenggara. So that's the way out, as well as education. Those two things are kind of linked.
Did you look at, I mean, were you there when the school lunches program was going on?
I've just heard stories about it, which just, in fact, in these remote parts of Flores, when I was last there, that program hadn't reached these remote areas. So I don't know whether it's reached them yet, but I think it would be considerable health and safety issues to develop those programs in remote places. I don't know how you would do it. It must be very challenging. And I'm not, yeah, anyway, let's not go too far into that. A lot of people have done research on that.
Can we go to online?
Okay.
From Rod Keenan, thank you, John, for the great presentations. What role are local governments playing in this setting? Are they mainly enforcement agents of higher levels of government, or are their interests and motivations aligned with the local community?
So I would say local government has a range of development programs, but they tend to be, I had that point around projects. They tend to be these very specific and small scale projects that last for a short period of time, and they're not yet able to develop integrated approaches to many of these problems. But they're seriously interested. I mean, when we had workshops with them, there was a lot of interest in what was emerging from our research. And the problem is whether there's capacity or budget to follow up. Even in the provincial government, I mean, a lot of people who are responsible for food security policy, they haven't done a course on food security or, like it's a very technical area. And so they're developing policy. I'm not trying to throw aspersions on them. They're great, a lot of great people there, but at the same time, they haven't necessarily had the training opportunities. I mean, we did one session, spent 2 days with them with a food system, teaching them how to do food system analysis. Because I've been teaching a course on that for several years here at ANU, and it was really it was a great opportunity to help them develop some new skills, and they were really interested in it. But you could see they hadn't necessarily have the right disciplinary backgrounds to think through many of those issues, or exposure to literatures or ideas. So, it's quite difficult for them to develop policies. And then we've got the clientelistic budgeting systems that you find in places like Nusa Tenggara, which, I don't want to go too far into that, but clearly they mean that budgets aren't necessarily developed in a way that might lead to the best development outcomes. Let me put it that way.
Second question is from Bavania. To what extent community have access to social assistance programs, and how these programs make a difference in their life?
Okay, thanks, Vania, for the question. A big shout out to Vania. So Vania, this very much aligns with the work you've done yourself, Vania. Vania did a PhD here recently and got flying examiners reports. Basically, there's a lot of the old people are not the elderly, are not really getting much social assistance. In fact, during the interviews, we often met elderly people who were falling outside the social security system. And also just randomly, you would meet households that are getting the social assistance, and then other households that are not, who are in a very similar situation. So unfortunately, this is a well-documented problem with social security, that it's got lots of holes in it. And all the questions of deservedness that Vania looked at in her thesis also play out in these kind of landscapes. But at least there is a social security system, and at least there are a lot of people that do get help from it. So I should say that, and it makes a big difference to people. But it would be great if it was broader and it provided more transformative forms of intervention.
Let's go back to the room. So 1, 2, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, your very interesting presentation. I have a layman question. You can ignore if it's right. According to your stories, the internal labor migration is a very important force shaping socio-economic life of this region, right? Maybe young people
do not like to log in the traditional agricultural sector and the rural activities. Therefore, don't you have to look at the issue not purely from the territorial point of view, but from a national point of view of generating jobs for these workers? That would be a good way of integrating the region in the national economy.
Right.
I mean, even if you develop rural areas according to your strategy, maybe young people don't want to remain locked in these traditional activities.
Yeah, so I think you're hitting on something. Basically, when you interview people, they say, well, why would I invest in the tree cropping system? Because the results are so insecure. So they don't see a life in agriculture as really providing them with a secure future. But at the same time, migration is so precarious. If they go off, there are no opportunities for them to move. Very few people can move to the city. There's just not, I mean, other people have done work on this. It's not my field, but I think some of the economists have done work on the ability of the industrial sector to absorb labour. They're just not that, yeah. And so particularly there are also networks. What you find is that in outer island Indonesia, they find it very difficult to get a foot into those kind of labour markets, whereas the Javanese can much more easily get absorbed. So it's the same with the Achinese. They find it very difficult to integrate. So what they end up doing is migrating into these precarious oil palm landscapes. And unfortunately, the jobs there are not secure. And because of the social reproduction, I've got a paper actually, if anyone's interested, on social reproduction issues in oil palm landscapes. The problem is in the oil palm landscape, the people have no subsistence economy. They're basically labourers in the oil palm system, and they're unable to grow much. So they're completely dependent on their cash income to buy food, which tend to be inflated in these remote parts of Kalimantan. So what they do is they leave the wife and the children in the village so that social reproduction happens in the village, and they do production. The production element of the household income comes from the migration. And so, and that's precarious, and the village is precarious. So that's where we've got this Moloch trap. So it's not, ideally you would have maybe a Russian Revolution solution that industrial development in Java would suck in all these people, but unfortunately it's just not happening. And the oil palm system is also not providing secure livelihoods.
Yeah, thanks, John, for a really fascinating discussion. And as you said, there are so many different elements that are so intertwined here, and trying to be expert on everything must have been a massive challenge. So I've been holding off asking this question because it sounds like I'm expecting another dimension to be discussed. But what I want to say flows out of the sort of issues that Terry just mentioned, which is really issues of political economy. You know, that certain people in a village or in the Kabupaten have more power than others, and that building the sort of coalitions that you've been talking about will inevitably confront questions of power at local levels and at higher levels. And then, of course, there's the issue of who controls the government, and its role. But did you have the opportunity to, or the interest in, delving further into issues of political economy and the obstruction to responses to some of these problems that are involved in power relationships in the village and at higher level?
So we try to incorporate the structural analysis in there. You can see in different parts of the presentation where I tried to do that, about the monopoly relationships in the market chains, around value chain capture, those sorts of things. But I mean, that would be another element to the story. I mean, I'm aware of it. I tried to include that in my analysis. I mean, a little bit wary of, you know, Kathy Gibson, who used to be here at the ANU. She always, although she was actually kind of a Marxist, she always argued against that Marxist idea of locking everything in and making it that no one's got agency, there are no possibilities of change. So there's that kind of dilemma. If you don't go too far down that political economy approach, you end up looking at the whole system as being completely locked up. And that could be an argument you want to make. But on the other side, there are opportunities for people to do things. So that's the kind of tension we're trying to navigate.
Yeah, although I would see a political economy analysis having the strength of doing exactly not what you were suggesting there. Not to see how everything is locked in and nothing can be done, but rather to identify places where there are perhaps interstices, where there are potential exercises in empowerment for people who are currently in powerless situations, but have some capacity to mobilise or potential to mobilise.
Yeah, so that's a good question because I teach stuff on political economy in Crawford. So I'm aware of all those dilemmas. The thing is, we just don't find those sort of actors in our research sites, sadly. I mean, the NGO community, the budgets for NGOs have really shrunk. And I think they played some of those collective action roles now, whereas NGOs in Nusa Tenggara tend to be service providers more than anything else. And the civil society, because so much of the population is orientated towards survival in the Moloch trap, or whatever you want to call it, there is very little of that community organisation going on. Now, I think historically the Catholic Church in Flores played some of those roles, but I don't currently seeing it playing those sorts of roles in areas where we are. So I'm just not sure who those actors might be, if you know what I mean. It's kind of an empty space, but I'm aware of it. And we just didn't identify that. I mean, the other option we saw is because of the deepening crisis, maybe these learning opportunities can emerge where coalitions of actors can come together and think about, what to act more altruistically. Maybe that's unrealistic, I don't know.
I wondered if Bapanas and DFAT might be a bit wary of you going too far into political analysis.
Well, it wasn't sort of our remit. I mean, what our remit was to think about how these community livelihood strategies could be brought into policy. And I think that's a worthy activity, actually. I think, and the social reproduction issue, how that can be brought into policy, that's another project. But these are the sort of things we were really focused on. But that's the political economy one is another project too. So there's multiple things you could do in this space. Okay.
All right, so it's right on the dot. So we're 2 p.m. So that's probably the end of the session today. And please join me to thank John for
Thanks everyone for the interesting and challenging questions. Giving me a lot of homework.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, also participating. Thank you.